Hello, everyone. This week we're going to pick up where we left off and jump straight into it. I'm going to start by talking about resting membrane potential of the cell membrane and how it's established. So I'm going to pull up the whiteboard here, new whiteboard. So as that's loading, if you remember from last week, we were talking about homeostasis and how there's an electrical gradient that is maintained across the membrane of every cell. I'm going to draw this line to establish it. Our RMP, just as a benchmark, sits at negative 70 millivolts. And that is because, as we talked about last week, there's a sodium potassium pump that's pumping out these ions, and it's pumping out three sodium ions and pumping in two potassium ions. For that reason, the way the chemical gradient is, there's always going to be a higher concentration of potassium on the inside of the cell than there is on the outside. And so, due to this action of the sodium potassium pump, it's a fairly even trade-off that's going on. So, at the end of the day, it really brings us to negative 5 millivolts. That'd be somewhere way up here. And the rest of that action that's bringing us into the negatives is actually the potassium leakage channels that are just simple diffusion, pretty much allowing the potassium to just flow outside of the cell freely as it pleases. And so we're going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about capacitance and how that relates to the RMP. So we're not really shifting gears at all, but I'm going to represent this concept by illustrating an equation that we use. Capacitance is represented by charge, is what the Q stands for, and voltage. To put in the simplest terms possible that I can, I would describe charge as meaning the amount of electrical force that is being stored, as opposed to volts, which is the sheer power or the oomph of the electrical force that is being stored. So you can kind of think of this as being a lot or a little, and this is being weak or strong. Capacitance is a fancy word, but essentially all that it means is the ability to resist change, almost like a buffer in the resting membrane potential. So if I were to say decrease the amount of electricity, to put it in probably overly simple terms, but to increase the strength of that electricity, I'm going to decrease my capacitance. Because if you can imagine this theoretical electricity that I'm talking about, I'm decreasing the amount that I have, but I'm increasing the strength, almost like compressing it into a tiny 100-pound ball. Now that's gonna rip right through the paper. That's gonna decrease my capacitance. Our resting membrane potential is likely gonna go wild because of that. It's gonna be shifting all over the place because of that highly concentrated electrical energy, that charge to voltage ratio. But let's look at it on the flip side. If we were to increase the amount of electric force, but decrease the strength of it, just kind of stretching it all out into like a long Play-Doh snake or like a slinky, ruining the spring so you can never play with it again. That's going to increase our capacitance, our ability to maintain a consistent resting membrane potential. Because if you think about it, if you're increasing the amount of tasks that you have to do in a day, but you're decreasing the difficulty of them, you're probably going to find your life a lot more manageable. Moving on to a related and similar concept, there's something that we call the length constant. And this one I'm going to need to draw another picture for. But length constant, I would describe as the amount of oomph of an electrical system, of an electrical signal. Our professor calls it the Bwong, but that's determined by the membrane resistance and the internal resistance regarding said system. So if I have a neuron here, here's the head with all the dendrites, soma going down through the axon, and then the roots at the very end. The electrical signal is coming from the soma, from the head, and it's pretty intuitive that as time goes on, the smaller the signal is going to get, and it's eventually going to peter out. The ability to keep this signal strong is called length constant, essentially. Length constant is an interesting concept because the way that I see it, it doesn't really matter what you do. Our cells are just designed to increase length constant no matter what. It's more of just a good, better, best scenario. Both things will increase, whether it's membrane resistance or internal resistance, length constant to a certain extent. So let's say that I'm adding some membrane resistance. I'm preventing ions from being able to enter this cell and interfere with signals that are coming down through the head. Perhaps I'll do that by adding myelin, which is essentially just a blob of lipids creating this axon sheath. And it's spreading these ion charges out. It's essentially creating this bulge on the outside of the membrane, which is nonpolar because it's just lipid. And it's repelling them even more than they would usually. From Bio 180, we know that every cell has a membrane that's made of a non-polar head. So it's gonna bounce those ions off. So the less we have outside interference, obviously, the easier the signal is going to travel. But let's also talk about what's going on inside of the axon. It's not as streamlined as you might believe from my 2-second drawing. But inside of cells, we're going to have proteins floating around. And those, far more often than not, are going to have an overall negative charge to them. What you're looking at are proteins with overall negative charges. And this signal is kind of going to bounce off them. They need to squeeze through, they need to weave through that traffic in order to continue down the axon, and hopefully that signal will still be strong enough when all is said and done to chain to the next neuron off screen here. That's the ultimate goal. But we can't get rid of these proteins. These are performing essential functions for the cell. So what can we do? We can't put them somewhere else. We can't give them an IOU. We can't make them take every other Thursday off. But what we can do, and we see this happen in biology, such as in giant squids, surprisingly enough, is we can just make the axon bigger. We can literally just give the oomph, the length constant, a boost by making the axon itself bigger. It's like adding another 3 lanes to your highway. So now you don't have to wait for that guy to get out of the fast lane. Makes sense, right? So really, no matter what you're increasing, length constant is going to go up to a certain extent. And myelin definitely has a big impact on that. The more myelin you have on the outside of a neuron, chances are it's also going to be a bigger neuron, and there's going to be more space for that electrical signal to travel down. Therefore, your length constant represented by lambda is going to increase. So let's move forward here. So all these things have an effect on resting membrane potential. It's essentially just the rate at which different ions are traveling back and forth across the cell membrane and creating an electrical potential. There's always going to be positive built up charges of potassium on the inside, more so down on the outside of the cell, excuse me. And there's always going to be more sodium on the outside of the cell as opposed to the inside. So the size of the resting membrane potential is going to depend on the state that we're currently in. And I'm going to build more on this topic in a moment. We're going to talk about something called action potentials. But before we do, I want to introduce one more equation, which is called the Nernst equation. And this has to do with equilibrium potential. I know that we're using the word potential a lot, but we'll get through it, I promise. Equilibrium potential of an ion, usually represented by X if you're doing the template, but we're going to say that it's sodium, I think we're actually going to go with potassium. We're going to pretend that this is a K, the positive charge, good enough. And the value here is usually negative 61. This is represented by Z, or the charge of said ion. And because ionic potassium has a charge of positive 1, that's the value that we're going to put there. And then we're going to do log. And then the concentration of said ion, so our potassium, both in to the cell and out of the cell. And I don't want to have to do all of the math on screen and waste everyone's time. So I have it written down right here. So let's say you have 150, just 150 potassium ions coming in. You can't accumulate charges. Obviously, these are coming with another negatively charged ion like chloride or fluoride. But physiologists just assume that's a given. So let's say you have 150 potassium ions going into the cell and a concentration of 5 coming out of the cell, which doesn't really make sense given the context of the fact that potassium ions are always at a higher concentration on the inside. Just ignore what I said there. This is inside and this is outside. So our equilibrium potential is going to end up equaling, after we've done all of those calculations, negative 90 millivolts. This represents what the resting membrane potential, or what the equilibrium potential is, sorry, when there is no net movement of ions. When we get to the point where there are no longer any potassium ions moving inside or outside of the membrane at any given moment. Related to the Nernst equation is the driving force coming right off of it. actually involves the equilibrium potential. I'm going to represent this with X and membrane potential. Membrane potential, if you could think about it this way, is where the cell is currently at. Equilibrium potential is where it wants to go. That's equilibrium potential is kind of the goal. And both of these things together, when you subtract equilibrium potential from membrane potential, is what we call driving force. This is really the meat and potatoes of what drives homeostasis and electrochemical gradient. So if I were to say that membrane potential was a very high positive number, like 100, that's what we're currently at, very positive, and I subtracted it from the value that we've got here, very small, very little, well, the driving force is going to go through the roof close to 200 because you have a cell that's at positive 100 millivolts. And the goal here, like we said, is to get to negative 90 millivolts, at least in the case of potassium here. Driving force is going to be one of 190. That's a large number. So you're going to see a lot of pressure behind the movement of those ions across the membrane in order to reach that equilibrium in a timely fashion. So returning to the idea of resting membrane potential, I'm going to introduce a concept that's called action potential. And I'm going to do that with a different type of marker and a different color. Yeah, that works. So usually the cell is lazy. It doesn't like to do much unless it's prompted to. Let's say, wow, okay, let's ignore that happened and we'll draw it over here. This is the new axis. So the resting membrane potential is lazy. And we talked a little bit about our threshold prior. Let's say that a stimulus happens here, like like a little electrical shock, like an electric signal. If it's strong enough to bring us up to the threshold here, then we're going to get something called the NAV, or our voltage gated sodium channel, to activate, to open up. It usually, so it's this little protein that has a lever and a little ball attached to it. Enough of a electrical signal of a charge building up inside of the cell, positive charge, will cause this lever to flip open, and it's going to allow, like we said, that gradient to flow into the cell. There's going to be always more sodium on the outside, and a simple law of diffusion states that all chemicals want to flow from a high concentration to a low concentration. All of the sodium on the outside of the cell, now that this gate is open because of the voltage, that change in the electrical gradient is going to cause all of the sodium to flow inside. And that's what causes, ignore that first part, all of these positively charged sodium ions to flow inside of the cell. And so we are up and away from our resting membrane potential. We are far from negative 70 millivolts. And eventually, you're also going to end up getting these uh, sodium voltage gated channels to open as well. Essentially, there's just so much positive charge built up in the cell at some point. All of the channels need to become open. The the ball that I was talking about earlier on this, so the voltage gated sodium channel has a protein that has some negative charges built inside of it. And if there's enough positively charged sodium on the inside, it's going to force those negative charges to repel and go up and clog up this channel again. And so now no longer can any positive sodium ions come into the cell. So we see this drop back down to the resting membrane potential, or down past the threshold, my bad. This is our resting membrane potential here. But the thing is, potassium channels don't work quite as fast. And there, like we talked about earlier, there's also just straight up potassium leakage channels that never really close. Potassium can pretty much go through them as much as they want. So we're going to see a little bit of an overshoot here. It's actually going to let go of more positive charges than it needs. And it's going to go even more negative than our resting membrane potential usually is. That's called hyperpolarization. The more negative you are in this context, you can say the more polarized. So our stimulus here, we see depolarization as it's getting more positive and reaching that threshold. And then we get what you could probably call hyperdepolarization as you're accumulating all of these positive charges until you eventually reach a tipping point. You've reached your carrying capacity of all of the positive charges you can hold within a cell. The sodium voltage gated channels close because they've had enough. And then we see that steep decrease of depolarization and eventually even hyperpolarization, as we said before. And then the charges will slowly return back to resting membrane potential as is determined by the electrical and chemical gradients. You can never really say at any point that all of the gates are open or all of the gates are closed because this is a constantly fluctuating landscape that we're talking about here. It's never going to be 100%, but even in the theoretical case that it was, that's going to flicker back to 99.5 or whatever constantly because this is an entire cell that we're talking about. These proteins are very small. So you're always going to have, no matter what's going on, you're going to have gates opening and closing, and eventually the cell's going to compensate and reach its equilibrium again. So to close this video with one more concept, I'm going to compare what we just talked about to something that's called a graded potential. So graded potentials look quite a bit different. We got our function of time here, just as we did before. They look, if I would describe them as choppier. They work according to a slightly different mechanism than action potentials do. This has more to do with um, concentrations of hormones, I would say. They work a lot slower than action potentials do. But to put this simply, I would say that you can do these a lot faster and repeatedly. There is no refractory period where it really hyperpolarizes and needs to wait to become slightly depolarized and reach resting membrane potential again. It's not as it doesn't follow this general shape nearly as much. But the longer that the stimulus is, the more it is going to be depolarized at that same state. Here we see the first signal. Here we see a stronger signal, both for the same amount of time. Here we see a signal that was the same strength as the first, but it was applied over a longer period. And so more of the ion or chemical was allowed into the cell, thus increasing its concentration and depolarizing. So this has more to do with chemicals than it does with electrical signals. And I think about it this way. Uh, I think about it this way. You're always going to think, send electrical signals throughout your brain faster than you're going to have hormones activated. And that's the best way that I can describe the use of action potentials here. And it's just that instant reset back to resting membrane potential is what changes it from the gradualness of action potential. That's essentially all I have to say without beating a dead horse. So thank you all for listening and hope you have a great week.